Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started. When everything starts to unravel, it's never all at once. It's the quiet signs, the faint shifts, that wear you down, piece by piece. That evening, I found myself waiting for Madison. She'd gone out with friends, telling me she needed some space. But as the minutes stretched into hours, and the clock ticked past midnight, the patience I had left started to evaporate. When the door finally creaked open, and she stumbled inside, I felt an icy knot form in my stomach. Her hair was a tangled mess, as if a storm had twisted through it. Her clothes hung off her body, frayed and disheveled, but it wasn't just the state of her appearance that hit me. It was the dampness on her thighs, a faint, undeniable moisture that made my heart drop. I stood frozen, unable to move. A foreign cologne clung to her, sharp and intrusive. It wasn't hers. It wasn't mine. It belonged to someone else. Without saying a word, I helped her to bed and got her cleaned up. "What happened, Madison?" My voice was strained, trying to hold on to calm, even though everything inside me was shaking. I needed an answer, but her eyes, glassy and unfocused, refused to meet mine. Through the haze of alcohol, she mumbled, her words slow and slurred. "It didn't mean anything, just once. I'm sorry." The words hit me like a physical blow, sharper than anything I'd ever felt. Sorry for what? I wanted to scream it, demand the truth right there, but I couldn't. Not in that moment, not with her in that state. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I tucked her into bed and left the room. I still clung to the faint hope that it wasn't as bad as it seemed. But deep down, my instincts whispered the truth, that something unforgivable had happened. The next morning, once the fog of alcohol had worn off, I knew I had to get answers, even though a part of me dreaded what I might find. The morning light was unforgiving. Madison woke with a groan, clutching her head, trying to piece together the hazy remnants of the night before. I sat in the kitchen, unable to shake the images from my mind. Sleep had been impossible. My thoughts kept looping, the slurred confessions, the unfamiliar scent, the way she looked. I needed the truth, and it was time to face it. She shuffled into the kitchen, still wearing the wrinkled clothes from the night before. Her eyes were red, worn out. Her gaze flickered over the table, where I'd laid out the evidence, photos I'd taken the night before. A close-up of the stains on her dress, a faint handprint near her waist. They spoke louder than words ever could. I hadn't taken the photos to hurt her, but to capture what my mind couldn't yet fully process. "Do you remember what you did last night?" I asked, my voice quivering with something deeper than anger, a hollow ache I could barely name. Her face crumpled, the weight of guilt settling over her. She didn't need to ask for clarification. She knew what she had done. Madison broke down, sobbing, her body shaking. "I'm sorry," she choked out, her voice thick with regret. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" I echoed, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "You don't just stumble into something like this. You made a choice. You went to that bar, got drunk, and let another man into your life." She tried to explain, to justify it, blaming the alcohol, the moment, the circumstances. But her tears didn't move me anymore. They felt hollow, just like her excuses. That's when it hit me. She wasn't apologizing to me. She was trying to soothe her own guilt, and that stung more than anything else. She couldn't grasp the damage she'd done, not just to our relationship, but to everything we'd built together. I couldn't listen to any more of her words. Standing up, I locked eyes with her and said, "I need some air." Then I walked out, leaving her alone with the mess she'd made. Betrayal doesn't fade. It lingers in every thought, in every question left unanswered. I tried, truly, to silence the doubts, but they gnawed at me. Who was he? Why her? And how long had it been going on? Her confession, slurred and disjointed, was my starting point. Among her scattered words, one name rose to the surface. Nolan. That was enough. A quick search on social media led me to him. Nolan fit every cliché. a polished, charismatic guy with an effortless charm, the kind who could talk his way into or out of anything. But what unsettled me more was the realization that he and Madison knew each other. She followed him, and he followed her back. This wasn't some random stranger. They had a connection. I dug deeper and uncovered something more unsettling. Nolan was married. He had kids. His social media was full of family vacations, birthday parties, and cozy mornings. He had it all, or at least he appeared to. Then again, so did I. Once. I needed to understand the extent of their relationship. Madison's phone was my next target. Late at night, when she was asleep, I unlocked it. That's when I found the messages. They weren't long, but they were damning. Nolan knew Madison would be at the bar that night. The exchange wasn't extensive, but it didn't need to be. It was enough to show me the truth. This wasn't a random encounter. It had been planned. I could barely hold the phone as I read their messages. This wasn't a mistake, a one-time slip. They both knew exactly what they were doing. That night, I made a choice. Nolan's wife deserved the truth. She needed to know who her husband really was. And once I confronted him, I would turn to Madison. The divorce papers were already in motion, but I needed closure before I could let go completely. I had the name. I had the evidence. And I had a plan. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. If my marriage was falling apart, his wouldn't stay intact. I struggled with the decision of whether or not I should reach out to his wife, Aurora, but in the end, I couldn't shake the feeling that she deserved to know. I carefully crafted a message, choosing my words with precision, and sent it. She replied within hours. We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe downtown, somewhere neutral where emotions could stay in check. When I arrived, Aurora was already there. She sat alone at a small table, her dark hair pulled back, dressed simply, her demeanor a mixture of nervousness and polite curiosity. She smiled faintly, her eyes brightening when she mentioned Nolan. It made what I had to say all the more difficult. I didn't try to soften the blow. Your husband had an affair with my wife, I said, keeping my voice steady. Her smile faded instantly, replaced by shock. Her hands trembled as she set down her coffee, the weight of my words settling between us. For a fleeting second, she remained silent, her gaze fixed on me with an intensity that suggested she was struggling to comprehend the truth I had just laid bare. Slowly, I reached into my bag, retrieving the evidence I had painstakingly gathered, screenshots of their conversations, photos from that evening, and even a hidden recording where my wife candidly mentioned his name. I let her absorb each piece, giving her space to feel the weight of the truth. As she examined the photos and listened to the recording, I watched the color drain from her face. Tears brimmed in her eyes, though she fought valiantly to keep them from falling. She wasn't ready to break. She sat motionless, her lips quivering as she grappled with the harsh reality before her. At last, she found her voice, trembling yet resolute. "Thank you for telling me," she whispered. I gave a slight nod, rising from my seat. There was nothing more to discuss. As I stepped out of the coffee shop, a storm of emotions surged within me. Fury, a strange sense of relief, even an undercurrent of guilt. Whatever unfolded between Nolan and Aurora was no longer my burden. My focus had shifted to reclaiming my life, severing ties with Madison, and leaving behind the remnants of what we once shared. Returning home felt like stepping into a stranger's house. The warmth that had once filled the space was gone, replaced by a cold emptiness. Madison was a shadow of the person I had known, crushed under the weight of her own guilt. It showed in her eyes, in the slump of her shoulders. She made desperate attempts to mend the fractures she had caused. In the beginning, there were endless tears. She pleaded with me to listen, to let her explain, to give us another chance. "I'll do anything," she vowed. "Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes." But every time I met her gaze, all I could see was the betrayal etched into my memory. She left me notes, small scraps of paper hidden in my coat pockets, tucked beneath my pillow. "I love you. I swear I'll never hurt you again. Please don't give up on us." At first I read them, but eventually I stopped. She began cooking my favorite meals, hoping to win me back with the comfort of familiar flavors. Yet, no matter her efforts, I couldn't sit across from her at the table and pretend everything was normal, because it wasn't. Part of me yearned to believe her, to find it in my heart to forgive, to salvage the life we had built. But the image of her with someone else was a poison I couldn't purge. The trust and respect that had been the foundation of our relationship were gone. One night, she confronted me in the living room. Her face was swollen from crying, her voice hoarse with desperation. "Please, Ryan," she choked out. "I love you. I'll do anything to make this right." For the first time in days, I truly looked at her. "I don't think you can," I replied, my voice low but steady. My words hit her like a physical blow. She collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, clutching her chest as though trying to hold herself together. Perhaps, in that moment, she felt a fraction of the agony she had inflicted on me. The days that followed were drowned in silence. No more fights, no more raised voices, just the oppressive quiet, thick with the remnants of what had been lost. I had hoped, however faintly, that the silence might bring clarity, that it might offer a path to healing. But deep down, I already knew the answer. Some fractures are beyond repair. In that quiet, I began preparing for the inevitable. I sorted through our finances, organized important documents, and started piecing together a future without her. I reflected on our memories, the good, the bad, wondering if any of it was enough to hold on to. One morning I found her in the living room, her stare locked on the floor as if searching for answers buried in the carpet. When she noticed me, her red-rimmed eyes met mine, her face drawn with exhaustion and despair. I held the divorce papers, pausing briefly. It wasn't hesitation about the decision, but the gravity of finality that gave me pause. "You made your choice that night," I said, my voice firm and clear. "This is mine." I placed the papers on the coffee table. She stiffened, her trembling hands reaching for them. "Ryan, no, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We can fix this." "I'll do whatever it takes," she cried, falling to her knees, gripping my hand with a desperate strength. Her sobs filled the room, raw and piercing. "Don't do this. Please, don't throw us away." But the truth was, she had already done that. With one selfish decision, she had destroyed the trust we had spent years building. And without trust, what was left? Gently, I pulled my hand free, my resolve intact. "I can't," I said quietly, shaking my head. "I've tried, Mad. I've thought it over from every angle," I continued. "But I can't see us the same way anymore." My voice held no anger. It didn't need to. The finality was clear enough. I turned and walked away, leaving her crumpled on the floor, her sobs echoing behind me. A complex wave of emotions surged through me. Grief, yes, but also an unexpected sense of relief. For the first time in days, I could breathe. It wasn't the ending I had wanted, but it was the one I needed. Some decisions carve scars too deep to fade, and hers was one of them. It's strange how the end of something you thought would last forever can leave you feeling hollow. But that was my reality. I walked away from that marriage a free man, though freedom wasn't what I had envisioned. For weeks, I couldn't bring myself to enter our bedroom. Her scent lingered, tied to memories I wanted to forget. I slept on the couch, but gradually things began to change. I stopped noticing the empty spaces she had left behind. Instead, I started imagining new possibilities. I rearranged the furniture, painted the walls, and reclaimed the house as my own. I wasn't just rebuilding a home, I was rebuilding myself. The cracks she left didn't vanish. The scars remained. But with time, they hurt less. In their place, I discovered something I hadn't felt in years: peace. As for Madison, I have no idea where life took her. Once the papers were signed, we ceased all contact. I heard whispers that she struggled to move on, that life had been unkind. People say time heals all wounds, but I disagree. Time doesn't erase the pain. It teaches you to live with it, to grow around it. For me, that meant learning to embrace solitude. I would rather live in quiet contentment than in a marriage tainted by betrayal. And as for Madison, I hope she found a way to live with her choices. Not for my sake, but for her own. In the end, we both lost something. I lost the woman I thought I knew, and she lost the life we had built together. But the difference is, I gained something far more valuable. I found myself, and that, above all, was worth every painful step. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you. Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started. The evening began without distinction, much like countless others before it. Dinner had concluded, and the usual exchange of words about chores and responsibilities filled the room. Amid this routine conversation, I casually mentioned a bill that required attention, a trivial question on the surface, yet her reaction was anything but ordinary. Her voice, sharp and biting, pierced through the familiarity of our evening. "I'm not your possession," she declared with an edge that stopped me cold. The words hung in the air, charged and unrelenting. For a moment I was paralyzed, unsure of how to interpret what she had just said. Was it a criticism of me? A rejection of the relationship as I understood it? Or was it a deeper challenge, a declaration that the foundation of our connection was flawed? The intensity in her tone and the resolute expression on her face made it clear this wasn't an offhand remark. It was deliberate, a line drawn in the sand where none had existed before. I sat there, nodding reflexively, though my thoughts were spinning. Something had shifted within me, subtle, yet undeniable. At first, my reaction wasn't anger, at least not in the fiery sense. What I felt was colder, more calculated. As I methodically cleared the table, her words echoed in my mind. I thought about all the sacrifices I'd made, late nights, endless problem-solving, the constant effort to make her life easier. And yet, her statement suggested that none of it mattered. What I had seen as care, she seemed to view as control. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her words looped endlessly in my mind. Was she right? Had I, without realizing it, exerted control over her life? Had I reduced our marriage to a series of transactions, or was this her way of avoiding the responsibilities we both committed to when we said, "I do"? I couldn't untangle her intent, but one thing became clear. She didn't view herself as accountable to me in the way I had always considered myself accountable to her. Slowly, a quiet determination began to form. If she didn't want to be seen as mine, then I would no longer treat her that way. But with that change came a new reality. I wouldn't carry the burden of her life anymore. This wasn't about revenge. It was about recalibration. If she wanted independence, I would give it to her entirely. The next morning, she acted as if nothing had changed, but I was already different. I resolved to adjust my approach without fanfare or confrontation. When she asked me to handle a bill, I responded evenly, "That's something you can manage." Her face registered mild confusion, but she didn't press the issue. It was a minor shift, yet for me, it marked a turning point. I stopped stepping in to resolve her problems. When the faucet dripped, I ignored it. When her car needed gas, I didn't grab the keys. She noticed the small gaps where my efforts had once been, but she said nothing, at least not immediately. The conviction behind her statement the night before fueled my restraint. I wasn't acting out of spite. I was acting with intention. If she didn't want to be owned, then she couldn't expect the benefits that came with it. The air between us grew taut, filled with an unspoken tension. She could sense the difference, though she didn't yet grasp its full extent. I chose not to elaborate. If she craved autonomy, she would need to embrace it fully. As I lay awake that night, a strange clarity settled over me. This wasn't a temporary adjustment. It was a fundamental change in how I approached our relationship. The days of shouldering every responsibility for her were behind me. From now on, I would let her experience life without the safety net I had always provided. The following morning, I lingered in bed, listening to the sounds of her morning routine. Normally, I'd be up early, making coffee and organizing my day. Not this time. When I eventually entered the kitchen, she stood by the coffee maker, her mug in hand. The car keys rested nearby, a silent reminder of the oil change she had mentioned. I said nothing. Finally, she broke the silence. "You're taking the car in, right?" she asked, her tone casual, as if expecting the usual response. I shook my head. "No, that's your car to deal with." Her expression flickered with disbelief. "What? You always handle this sort of thing." "Not anymore. It's your responsibility," I said, keeping my voice steady. She didn't argue, but the tension in the room was unmistakable as she left, the door closing with a sharp finality. That day marked a definitive shift. She began noticing the absence of my usual interventions, the small voids I had deliberately left. When she called to remind me about the insurance payment, I replied calmly, "The folder has all the details. You can handle it." A long pause followed. "Why are you acting like this?" she finally asked, her voice tinged with irritation. "I'm not acting. I'm just giving you the independence you asked for," I replied evenly. She let out a short, bitter laugh before ending the call. By the evening, the strain between us had deepened. I left the trash unemptied and the dishes untouched, tasks I once did without a second thought. She glanced at the mess, but stayed silent. At dinner, her frustration was palpable. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm. "What's going on with you?" I met her gaze directly. "You told me you're not my possession, right?" "Yes," she replied, her tone defensive. "Then you're not my responsibility either," I said calmly. Her face faltered, and she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. After a moment, she left the room, shutting the door behind her. In the silence that followed, I felt no satisfaction. Watching her struggle wasn't gratifying, but it was necessary. If she wanted autonomy, I would give it to her, fully. Over the days that followed, I withdrew further, dismantling the patterns we had built together. One evening, she came home to a house dim and quiet. The trash remained by the door, untouched. The usual warmth of lights and dinner was absent. She glanced at me, lounging on the couch, and sighed audibly. "Are you really just sitting there?" she asked, exasperation lacing her voice. Without looking up, I replied simply, "Yes." The door closed with a loud thud as she strode inside, her frustration palpable as she flung her bag onto the counter. "Would it kill you to take out the trash?" she asked, her tone sharp. I leaned back casually, shrugging. "It's not that heavy. You can manage." Her expression turned incredulous, and for a fleeting moment, I thought she might explode into an argument. Instead, she yanked the trash bag from the bin and marched out, the door's slam echoing her displeasure. The following morning greeted me with an unfamiliar sight, the sink brimming with unwashed dishes. It was the first time she'd left them unfinished, a wordless declaration more pointed than any outburst. She wasn't backing down from this standoff, but I wasn't looking for victory, just trying to prove my point. Over the next few days, the cracks in our routine widened. The pantry shelves emptied as I stopped refilling them. Her laundry piled up, untouched, despite my usual habit of folding it without being asked. Each neglected task was a tiny rebellion, adding to the growing tension between us. By midweek, the unease reached a tipping point. She came home to find the house dimly lit, the power cut off after the unpaid utility bill was ignored. Storming into the living room, her face was flushed with irritation. "The power's out," she said, her voice sharp. "Why didn't you handle the bill?" I met her gaze evenly. "You knew it was due. The details are in the folder." Her frustration spilled over. "Why are you acting like this? You're being ridiculous." I rose slowly, letting the words linger. "Ridiculous? You've said you're not my responsibility, right? Well, I'm respecting that. Independence means taking responsibility for your share." For a moment, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. Then she scoffed, shaking her head. "This isn't about independence. It's just you being spiteful." I didn't answer, letting her accusation hang in the air as I walked past her. That evening, I heard her struggling through a customer service call, her frustration evident. Normally, I'd step in and handle it for her, but this time, I didn't. It wasn't satisfying to watch, but it reaffirmed my resolve. If she wanted me to step back, I would, even if it made life harder for both of us. By the end of the week, the house felt foreign. The mess and unfinished chores were just surface signs of a deeper shift. The rhythm we once shared was gone, replaced by a strained silence that weighed on every interaction. Saturday morning, I sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and scrolling on my phone. She shuffled in, her hair disheveled, and opened the fridge. Finding it nearly empty, she slammed the door shut with unnecessary force. "This can't go on," she said tightly. I glanced up briefly. What can't? She spun to face me, her frustration spilling over. This thing you're doing, acting like a bystander in your own house. We're supposed to be a team." I set my phone down and leaned back in my chair. "Are we? Because from where I'm standing, teams share responsibility. Lately, it doesn't feel like I'm part of yours." Her jaw tightened and she crossed her arms. "Don't twist my words. I never said I wanted you to check out entirely." "That's the thing about words," I replied evenly. "Once they're spoken, they carry weight. You made it clear you didn't want to feel like you owe me anything. So I've stopped making you feel that way. It's a two-way street." Her voice rose, tinged with exasperation. "This isn't about owing anything. It's about respect. I don't want my life to revolve around your decisions." I stood, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Respect? You think respect is me silently carrying every burden, paying every bill, cleaning every mess? And then you tell me all of that makes you feel controlled? That's not respect." She flinched, the fight momentarily leaving her as her arms dropped to her sides. Then, squaring her shoulders, she said quietly, "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask you to do everything." "No," I agreed, stepping closer. "But you relied on it. Every time I stepped in, you let me. Every time I carried more than my share, you leaned on it. And when I tried to talk about it, you dismissed me." Her eyes glistened as she looked away, her hands balling into fists. "So now what?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Do we just keep tearing each other apart?" I hesitated, my gaze drifting back to the coffee cup on the table. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I do know I'm done being the only one holding everything together. If independence is what you wanted, you've got it. Just don't expect me to pick up the pieces when it's too much." She stood there, silent, waiting for me to take back my words. When I didn't, she let out a shaky breath and left the room, closing the door softly this time. The quiet that followed was heavier than the slamming doors of the past few days. In the days that followed, little changed. The gulf between us grew wider, our conversations clipped, and interactions carefully measured. Every word seemed laden with unspoken meaning, every gesture tinged with hesitation. We had become strangers sharing the same space, each unsure how to mend the rift. The first real shift came when her friend Flora called me. Usually, Flora went directly to her, but this time she tried me instead. "Hey," she said cautiously. "I've been trying to reach her, but she's not answering. Is everything okay?" I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "She's fine, just busy." Flora's skepticism was clear. "Busy? She skipped our lunch on Saturday. That's not like her." I deflected, my voice distant. "You should ask her about it." And just like that, the cracks in our facade became impossible to ignore. It seemed like the conflict had finally settled, but it hadn't. Just a few days later, my mother called me out of the blue. As it turned out, my wife had confided in her during a moment of frustration. The tone in my mother's voice instantly transported me back to my teenage years, when I'd often find myself on the receiving end of her disappointment. "What's going on between you two?" she asked, her voice firm. She told me you're refusing to pull your weight around the house. That doesn't sound like the person I raised. I sighed deeply, rubbing my temples. It's not that simple, I replied. Then make it simple, she shot back without missing a beat. Marriage isn't about keeping score. It's about working together. Her words hit home, though I didn't say anything in response. What was the point? She couldn't possibly understand the layers of frustration and the silent grievances that had built up between us over the years. The tension wasn't limited to our home life. It was beginning to spill over into everything else. At work, I found myself distracted, replaying old arguments in my head and wondering when things had started to go so wrong. My wife seemed to be struggling too. One afternoon, I overheard her apologizing to her boss on a Zoom call for missing a deadline, a rare lapse for someone who had always been so meticulous and organized. The cracks in her armor were becoming more evident with each passing day. One evening, I walked in to find her sitting on the couch with her laptop open, her hands covering her face. She looked up when she heard me enter, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "The internet's down," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I called the provider, and apparently, the bill hasn't been paid." I hesitated, torn between offering to help and letting her handle it. After a pause, I finally said, "You know how to take care of that, right?" She didn't respond. Instead, she closed her laptop, leaned back against the couch, and stared blankly at the ceiling. "I can't do this anymore," she murmured. Her words stopped me in my tracks. "What do you mean?" I asked cautiously. "This," she said, motioning around the room. "Everything. I feel like I'm drowning, and you're just standing there, watching." I wanted to protest, to remind her that she'd always insisted on being independent. But as I looked at her, the words caught in my throat. She didn't seem defiant or stubborn. She looked utterly defeated. That's when it hit me. This stalemate wasn't just hurting her, it was eroding both of us. The house was in chaos, the bills were piling up, and our stubbornness had only driven a deeper wedge between us. Whatever point I'd been trying to make no longer seemed worth the cost of what we were losing: each other. I sat down across from her, the silence between us heavy but different, not filled with animosity, but with exhaustion. For the first time in weeks, we weren't fighting. I never wanted it to get to this point, I admitted. Her tired eyes met mine, reflecting a mix of sadness and regret. "Neither did I," she said softly. We sat there quietly, both trying to process what had gone so wrong. There were no sudden apologies, no dramatic gestures of reconciliation. But in the days that followed, something shifted. We weren't aligned yet, but we were both too drained to keep fighting. The first step forward was small. One morning, I found her at the kitchen table surrounded by piles of bills and papers. She glanced up when I walked in, her expression tentative. Then, she gestured to the chair across from her. "Can we work on this together?" she asked, her tone cautious. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't a challenge either. I sat down, and together we started sorting through the mess we'd both ignored for far too long. She asked questions about payments and due dates, and I answered without irritation or sarcasm. For the first time in weeks, we were a team again, not because we were obligated to be, but because we both recognized it was necessary. That moment set the tone for what came next. She began tackling tasks with renewed determination, making calls to service providers, scheduling appointments, and even cooking dinner without waiting for me to take over. In return, I stepped up in ways I hadn't before, not because I felt guilty, but because I wanted to lighten her load. I started cleaning the dishes she left behind or taking out the trash without a second thought. We didn't return to what we once were, but we made progress. Slowly, the dynamic began to change. One evening as we watched TV, she muted the volume and turned to me. "Do you think I don't appreciate you?" she asked quietly. Her question caught me off guard. "Sometimes yes," I admitted. It felt like everything I did went unnoticed. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. I didn't mean to make you feel that way. I think I just assumed you could handle everything without realizing how it might affect you. And I never told you when I needed help, I said. I let it fester until it turned into resentment. That honest exchange marked a turning point. We began having more open, vulnerable conversations. They weren't always easy, and disagreements still flared up occasionally, but the effort was mutual. Over time, we started to rebuild what we'd almost lost. It wasn't about one person taking on all the responsibility anymore. It was about finding balance. She learned how to lean on me without losing her sense of independence, and I learned how to step back without feeling unappreciated. Things weren't perfect, but they didn't need to be. The clutter in our home gradually disappeared, though the emotional scars remained, serving as a reminder of how close we'd come to falling apart. They also stood as evidence of the effort it had taken to rebuild. One evening over dinner, she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. I don't want things to go back to the way they were, she said. But I don't want to lose what we have now either. I squeezed her hand gently and nodded. Me neither. And with that, we found a new rhythm, not as two people keeping score, but as partners navigating the complexities of life together. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.